He paid $60 for a box that everyone said could never be opened. By midnight, that box would change everything. Stay till the end, you will not believe what was welded inside. The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $60, and the biggest man on the lot laughed at him in front of the whole county. Walt Henley did not laugh back. He just took his hand off the rusted lid, the bid already his, and looked down at the thing he had bought. A heavy steel machinist's toolbox. Somebody had welded shut along the seam and left out in the weather. The lid sealed to the body with a crude, lumpy bead of weld. The whole box scaled over in orange rust, a price chalked on the front in a hand that had already decided it was worthless. It was a cold, bright Saturday morning, the 6th of October, 1984, at the Ward Estate auction behind the closed machine shop on the Depot Road, 2 miles east of Caldwell, Ohio. Walt was 72 years old, broad through the shoulders, a little stiff in the knees now, the way a man gets after 50 years of kneeling on concrete with a torch in his hand. He had a deeply lined face, sunburned and creased deep around the eyes, short steel gray hair under a faded denim work cap, white stubble, and pale steady eyes that did not move fast. He wore a light blue chambray shirt worn white at the elbows and a dark canvas jacket. Worked into the cracks of his hands was the gray grime of welding soot that 50 years of scrubbing had never quite gotten out. Walt had been a welder and a machinist his whole working life, and he had just paid $60 for a box everyone agreed could not even be opened. The man who laughed was Buck Mallory. Buck ran the biggest salvage and scrap operation in 3 counties. A heavy-set man of 48 in a red company polo stretched tight across his belly, jowls clean-shaven and sunburned, hair gone thin on top. He had a clean, late-model flatbed tow truck parked at the gate with his yard's name on the door, and a habit of buying scrap steel by the ton and never once wondering what was inside it. $60, Buck said loud so the men along the chain link could hear. $60 for a box you can't even open. What are you going to do, old-timer? Hang it on the wall? Look at him. The Tin Man bought himself a tin box. He coined the name right there in front of the crowd, and it stuck to Walt for the rest of that autumn. The Tin Man. The men laughed because Buck laughed the way a crowd does when the loud man gives them permission. Walt said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that steel does not answer to noise. What none of them knew, what Buck Mallory could not have known, pointing and grinning in his good red shirt, was that the box had come out of the shop of a machinist named Elias Ward, who had run that closed building for 51 years and died the winter before. And the seam had not rusted shut or rattled loose. It had been welded. Somebody had taken a torch to that lid on purpose and sealed it cold. Men weld a thing open. They do not weld a thing shut unless they mean for it to stay that way. And unless there is something inside worth the trouble of the weld. Walt was the only man in that lot who knew the difference. And he would have the box open before the night was out. And the thing he cut out from behind that welded seam would change how the whole town remembered a dead man, and how it looked at a living one. But before we go further, if stories about quiet, patient people outsmarting loud bullies pull you in, this one is going to stay with you. Make sure you are subscribed to Storysphere because what happens next is the part worth waiting for. Walt had struck his first arc at 15 in 1927, learning the trade under a shop foreman named Otis Freeman, an unhurried man in a leather apron with hands that never rushed, and a rule he said about once a week. Any fool can lay a bead, Otis told him. But a tradesman reads one. A weld is a man's handwriting in steel. And if you look close enough at how it was run, you can tell whether he was calm or scared, skilled or guessing, taking his time or out of it. For 57 years, Walt had laid beads and read them. He had welded bridge rail and busted machine frames, and patched 1,000 things the modern world would have thrown away. A kind of skill the county had quietly stopped having a use for. The new shops bought parts in boxes, and threw the broken ones in Buck Mallory's bin. A man who could read steel like a letter was a thing the modern world was finishing with. And Walt knew it. He bought the box anyway. While the other men kicked the tires of a flatbed trailer and bit up a drill press, Walt had crouched by that rusted box for a long 10 minutes, his reading glasses down his nose, and he had run his thumbs slow along the lumpy seam, and he had felt what his eyes already told him. That bead had not been laid by a careless hand. It had been run steady and close and deliberate, a clean, cold seal under 50 years of rust. The work of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and had a reason to do it. To Buck Mallory, the box was a ruined hunk of scrap steel worth maybe $4 at the bin. To Walt Henley, it was a sealed letter that no one had been able to read, written in the only language he had spent his whole life learning. And he meant to answer it. It took 2 younger men and a hand truck to wrestle the box onto the bed of Walt's old half-ton pickup, 160 pounds of rusted steel and whatever was sealed inside it, and the tailgate sat down hard on its springs. Buck watched from beside his clean flatbed, shook his head, and said something to the man next to him that made him laugh. Walt ratcheted 2 straps over the box, checked each one twice with a thumb hooked under the webbing, and drove the 9 miles back into Caldwell at 35 miles an hour, with no hurry in him at all. There is a kind of patience that looks like weakness right up until the moment it doesn't. And Walt Henley had a lifetime of it strapped down in the bed of that truck. Now here's where it gets interesting, because what Walt found inside that box was not just going to surprise the whole town, it was going to expose a secret one family had been hiding for years. Keep watching. The story got around Caldwell before the box was even off the truck. By Monday, men who had not stopped by in years came by on thin excuses, a gate hinge to look at, a mower deck to mend, just to lean in the doorway of his shop and see the welded box squatting on his floor. Roy Tibbetts, who ran the feed store and had known Walt since they were boys, stood in the door a long minute and finally said it plain. "Walt, you gave Buck Mallory's auction $60 for a thing that won't never open. What's got into you?" Walt was filing a burr off a clamp and did not look up. "It'll open," he said. And that was the whole of his answer. By Wednesday, the Tin Man was what they called him down at the diner. Said warm enough, but said all the same. And Buck Mallory told the story twice over a plate of eggs, building it bigger each time. Walt heard about it and did not answer. He had spent 50 years learning that a thing either opens or it doesn't, and that the noise a crowd makes has got nothing to do with which. Elias Ward had been the best machinist in that part of Ohio, and the quietest. Folks called him Eli. He had opened the shop on the Depot Road in 1933. A lean, upright man who could turn a part to 1/1000th of an inch by feel, and never once raised his voice doing it. For 51 years, the Ward shop had made and mended the things that kept the county running. Pump shafts for the wells, gears for the grain elevator, a broken casting for a man who couldn't afford a new machine. Eli married late, lost his wife early, and raised one daughter, Ruth, mostly alone in the rooms above the shop. The town respected Eli the way it respects a thing it has always had and assumes it always will. What the town did not know much about was the partner. Back in the 1960s, short on money and long on work, Eli had taken on a younger man named Del Mallory, Buck Mallory's father, who put up cash for new machines in exchange for half the shop. Del was a backslapper and a talker, very good in a room and not to be trusted on paper. And over the years he drifted out of the trade and into salvage and scrap, where the money was faster and the work was lighter. The handshake that built the shop slowly became a stack of papers nobody but Del had read all the way through. Then Eli's hands began to shake and his eyes went, and Del Mallory began very quietly to wait. Eli Ward died on a January night in 1984, alone in the shop, 79 years old. The town buried him and said the right things and called it the end of an era. Within a month, Del Mallory produced a document, a second partnership agreement signed and dated, that gave him not half the Ward shop, but all of it, the building and the land and what was in the bank, leaving Eli's daughter Ruth with the furniture and the funeral bill. Ruth Ward Kessler was 53 by then, a tired, dignified woman with her father's careful hands and none of his luck. Scraping by 2 counties over, she looked at the paper with her father's signature on it, and something underneath it that did not look right and never would. And she had no money for a lawyer and no proof of anything. And the law is an expensive country for a poor person to go looking for justice in. So the Ward shop was emptied and sent to auction, and Del Mallory took the building. And the only thing that came out of that estate that nobody wanted was a rusted toolbox welded shut, which Buck Mallory's own auction sold to an old welder for $60, while Buck stood by and laughed. Walt did not know all of that yet. The Monday the box sat on his shop floor, he knew Eli Ward a little, the way one tradesman knows another. They had nodded across 40 years of the same hardware store, 2 quiet men who respected each other's hands without ever saying so. And he knew, kneeling by the box with his glasses down his nose, that whoever had welded this lid shut had done it with a steady torch and a clear purpose, and that whatever was inside had been worth a dying man's last careful hour. Walt was not a curious man by nature, but he had spent his whole life believing that a thing built with that much care was owed the courtesy of being understood, and he meant to give the box that, whatever it cost him. He did not rush at it. For 3 evenings he only looked, wire brushing the rust off the seam until the weld showed clean. A single steady bead, run lid to body all the way around. The work of a man whose hands had gone bad at fine machining, but who could still, with a torch braced and his elbows in tight, lay one honest seal. Walt understood then that Eli Ward had welded this himself. Near the end, when a steady cut was about the last steady thing left in him. A man does not seal a box like that against weather. He seals it against people. And Walt, who had no idea yet what was inside, felt the back of his neck go cold with the certainty that he was the first man Eli had trusted to open it, simply by being the only one patient enough to try. He cut it on the 4th night. He chalked a careful line a finger's width inside the weld, so the torch would take the bead and not the box, and set out a bucket of water and a fire blanket, the way Otis Freeman had drilled into him 60 years before. He lit the cutting torch a little after 8, the first blue flame hissing at the tip, and tipped the helmet down over his face. And the quiet shop filled with the small, steady roar of the work. The first orange spark jumped, and then a fan of them, a bright fountain pouring off the steel and bouncing across the concrete, and Walt ran the flame slow along the chalk line, no faster than the metal wanted to give. The molten seemed glowing and parting under his hand a 1/4 inch at a time. His knees ached, and his eyes were not young behind the dark glass. But his hands, when there was a torch in them, were the same hands they had always been. And they did not shake and they did not hurry. And a little before 10 o'clock the last of the weld let go, and the lid of the box nobody at the auction could open came free in Walt's gloved grip, with a sound like a held breath finally letting go. He shut off the gas and pushed the helmet back. He let the steel cool a while because a careful man does not reach into hot metal no matter what is waiting. Then he pulled his glove off and lifted the lid the rest of the way by hand. Inside, where the rust had never reached, the steel was dry and clean, and the air smelled of old oilcloth and cold iron. There were 3 things in that box, packed so they would not shift, and Walt took them out one at a time and laid them on the bench under the light. The first was a folder wrapped in oilcloth, and inside it the original Articles of Partnership of the Ward Machine Shop, dated the spring of 1964, signed by Elias Ward and Del Mallory both, a plain 1-page agreement that gave Del 1/2 of the business in exchange for his cash, and not 1 inch more for as long as the shop should run. Folded with it was a second sheet in Eli's own exact hand, a dated witness statement, signed by Eli and by old Otis Freeman before he passed, swearing that he had signed only the one agreement in his life, that any paper claiming to give Del Mallory the whole shop was a forgery laid over his shaking signature, and that the true and equal half of everything was, and had always been, meant for his daughter Ruth. The proof Ruth Ward Kessler had needed and could never reach had been sealed in steel 9 miles away the whole time. The second thing was money. Not in any bank Del Mallory's family had a hand in. Eli had stopped trusting those rooms years before. But cash, a thick brick of it, banded in paper, 5s and 10s and 20s, saved out of 51 years of honest parts work. The rainy day account of a careful man who had watched his partner turn slick and kept something where slick hands could not get at it. Walt was no banker, but he had held enough of other men's hard savings to know he was looking at the better part of a life's keeping, money enough to hire any lawyer in the state and have plenty left to start a daughter over. He set it down gently and wiped his clean hands on his trousers out of pure habit. The third thing was a letter, 1 page, folded twice in a steady old-fashioned machinist's hand, sealed in an envelope that said, "Open only in pencil. To the man with patience enough to open this." And Walt Henley, 72 years old, alone in his shop a little before midnight, put on his reading glasses and read a dead man's last honest words. "If you are reading this," Eli Ward had written, "then you did what no one in a hurry ever could, and that tells me I can trust you. Because a man who will spend a whole night on a sealed box is a man who finishes what he starts. I welded this shut with my own torch because it was the last clean weld I had left in me, and because the man who calls himself my partner cannot lay a bead, and so would never think to look inside a thing he could not pry. What is in this box is the truth, and my Ruth's half of everything I built. Del has a paper he is waiting to use. It is a lie laid over my shaking name. Do not let it stand. Find my daughter, Ruth Kessler, and put this in her hands, and let an honest tradesman be the one to undo what a slick one did. A man's life is not the noise his partner makes over his grave. It is the one true thing he troubled to seal up tight, where only a patient hand would ever find it. Walt read it twice. Then he folded it along its old creases and sat for a long while in the quiet, with the cut box open in front of him, and the shop cooling around him, and somewhere out past the window, the first gray light beginning to come up over Caldwell. He could have done nothing. An old man with $60 in a rusted box and no stake in another family's grief. And no one would ever have known. Instead, Walt wrapped the deed and the witness statement and the brick of cash in the letter, back in the oilcloth. And that Monday he asked the feed store man where Ruth Kessler had moved to, drove the 2 counties over, and knocked on a small door with his cap in his hands. When Ruth came to it, tired, careful, so much her father's face that it stopped him a moment, Walt did not make a speech. He set the bundle in her hands and said only, "This was your dad's." He sealed it himself. He wanted you to have what's in it. Then he stood on the step while she opened it, and watched a woman who had been quietly robbed in plain sight read her father's hand, telling her the truth at last. And he took his leave before she could thank him, because a man does that kind of thing and then gets out of the way of it. The witness statement was real, and Otis Freeman's signature on it was known to half the county. And the forged paper Del Mollieri had been holding came apart the moment a lawyer set the 2 documents side by side. It did not even take a trial. Confronted with a dead machinist's sealed and witnessed word, the Mallorys gave the Ward shop and the savings back rather than answer for the forgery in open court. And the law looked at them hard enough that they were glad of the bargain. The truth had ridden out a whole winter inside scorned steel, and come back to set a wronged woman on her feet. And it had taken $60 and 1 patient old welder to carry it the last 9 miles home. Buck Mollieri heard it the way everyone heard it. The big salvage man who had laughed at $60 and christened Walt the Tin Man in front of the county said very little. He had stood 8 feet from that box and seen only rust because Buck weighed steel and Walt read it, and that was the whole distance between the 2 of them. His family gave back what was never theirs. The shine came off the Mollieri name in a way no one announced and everyone felt. And within a couple of years, Buck had sold the yard and moved his operation south. The town did not say much about that either. It was busy with better things by then. Ruth Kessler opened her father's shop again the next spring. She could turn a part to 1,000th by feel the way he had taught her before she could ride a bicycle. And the Ward machine shop ran once more on the depot road. In the front corner of it, behind a pane of glass, she set the rusted toolbox with its lid cut open the way Walt had left it, and beside it, a small card with her father's name. Folks who came in to have a part made would stand at it a minute, run a finger near the bright cut line in the old weld, and ask what it was. And Ruth would tell them. Walt Henley went back to his shop behind the house and went on mending the things the world threw away. He took not a cent and was not offered one, and would have been embarrassed by either. Otis Freeman's old leather apron still hung on its nail by the door, and Walt kept it there. On a warm evening late that summer, with the light going gold over the depot road and the swallows working the eaves of the open shop, Walt drove out to look at the box behind its glass one more time. 72 years old and a little stiffer in the knees than the October he bought it. He stood at the window with his cap in his hands and rested his palm flat on the warm glass over the scaled, rusted steel, in the same place his hand had rested on the lid the morning the whole county laughed. He did not go in. He just looked at the cut seam and the open lid and Eli Ward's name on its little card. And after a while he put his cap back on and drove home. A man does not weld a box shut to hide what is worthless. He welds it shut to make sure the right hands are the ones that finally open it. So I'll leave it with you the way Eli left it for whoever had the patience. If you had crouched at that auction and felt that weld run steady and deliberate under your thumb, would you have paid the $60 and trusted a dead man's sealed box to be worth a whole night with a torch? Or would you have laughed along with the loud man in the red shirt, and let the truth rust shut forever? If this story stayed with you, you know what to do. Subscribe to Storysphere because the next story might be the one that stays with you longest.